Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways Real Railway Profile. And this morning we're looking at the history of one of the most successful but short-lived steam locomotive designs to ever run in the UK. We are of course looking at the British Rail Standard Class 9F 210 locomotives. We'll be looking at the history of these popular but very short-lived designs. We'll also be covering the history of some of the models available past and present, and with Hornby announcing a brand new double O gauge model in the 2021 range in the last few days. It's a great time to look at the history of these locos and of course find some great inspiration to get them onto your model railways too. So if you've got any questions regarding these particular locomotives, feel free to ask any questions you have in the chat. If you're watching a little bit later, feel free to put a comment under the video or get in touch with our customer experience team, who would be more than happy to help you out too. Otherwise, we have to head back a little bit in history to find out just why the 9Fs were constructed, what their purpose for their design was. And we're heading right back to the formation of British Railways in 1948. The British Transport Commission outlined a plan for the major electrification and dieselisation of the network throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. But a small number, well, an initially small number, shall we say, of standard design locomotives were to be made, mainly for mixed traffic and express passenger duties, of several different designs to help this along and keep, of course, steam going where the experience was with the crews for quite some period. Although it was initially planned at smaller numbers, in the end there was just under 1,000 of these standard design locomotives. And while the earlier designs did concentrate on locomotives such as the Britannia and the standard 4 and 5 mixed traffic locomotives, there was no real early provision for a heavy freight locomotive. This was well fulfilled in the UK's railway network at the time, with hundreds of the former War Department austerity 280s and 210s entering service with British Rail at this time, working along other successful designs with the Stanier 8Fs and other designs from other Big Four railway companies. But these were quite slow locomotives. They were heavy plodders that could really haul a heavy train. And although they weren't the most reliable, the WD austerities did have strength in numbers, but what they lacked was speed. So a new design was needed to cater for a faster freight locomotive, initially requested by the eastern region of the British Rail network, that a faster locomotive that could fit better within the crew hours that could operate the locos. Within around 8 hours or so, they wanted to get further, they wanted to have faster services, they wanted to fit them in against more services that were speeding up with the introduction of early diesels and early multiple units at the time there too. So Robert Riddles took up the challenge. He was the chief mechanical engineer of British Railways at the time. He'd served with the War Department and helped construct the War Department 280 and 210 freight locomotives too. So he had a bit of a background in this area, but the initial locomotive design was actually for a 282 wheel arrangement with the boiler off the Britannia class that had just entered service used on this new freight design. In the end, Robert Riddles decided to replicate the 210 wheel arrangement, which he had implemented on a smaller number of his War Department austerity locomotives, some of which at this time were now operating for British Rail in Scotland, and this was the new design that came about. So it's a very rare wheel arrangement on the UK's railway scene. We generally don't see locomotives with 10 coupled wheels as we see here. And as you can imagine, that does give the locomotive quite a long wheelbase. So some extra play was allowed in the wheels, and the centre wheel does not actually have a flange. It is a flangeless wheel to allow the locomotive to get round some of the tighter curves on the network out there. So this design was started to be constructed, started to be put together as various standard designs were coming into service. And the first locomotives were launched into traffic in January 1954. Almost got the wrong season there. And you can see here locomotives as they came into service, surrounded by locomotives of previous heavy freight designs, including the Stanier 8Fs there. So these were an immediately successful design. The first locomotives were built at Crewe, and many of the class were actually built at Crewe, with more and more orders coming through and eventually arriving at 251 of these standard 9F locomotives. Although we say the word standard, they were a standard design, but a couple of experimental adaptations were included, and also some minor variations to work certain parts of the railway too. One of the first of these was the Crosty boilered 9F. These were 10 locomotives numbered 92020 to 92029 that were fitted with an experimental Italian-style preheated boiler. You can see under the main boiler there, the preheating system, which would warm the boiler and was supposed to aid with efficiency. Unfortunately, the results weren't quite as expected on these designs. The preheater wasn't as effective as the suppliers had made out. And you'll also see one major issue on this locomotive. You can see just where the cab should be, that it's actually covered in steam too. The exhaust for this locomotive was to the right of the loco. You can just see the steam emitting from behind that smoke deflector there. And this really did have issues with the driving views on these 10 locomotives. So they didn't last long in Crosty form. They were rebuilt into a more natural form with the Crosty boilers removed, but then the initial boilers still remaining in place. With the smaller boiler style on these locomotives, they were downgraded to 8F rather than 9F status, but they did still last in traffic right through until the mid-1960s. So that was the main experiment with these locomotives, to change them over to still get some more efficiency out of the design. There was also further locomotives, around 13 or so, I believe, that were fitted with Westinghouse air brakes for use on the tyne dock system. Now, they were fitted with air pumps, rather than air brakes, as the wagons had air doors on them, so they were released by air pressure, similar into how air brakes work, but this was for the specific wagons that worked on the tyne dock iron ore services. And 13 of these locomotives gained the equipment, but otherwise were standard 9Fs and otherwise part of the main fleet. Speaking of where the fleet went, they went pretty much everywhere apart from Scotland. There was allocations in South Wales, there was allocations very occasionally, but not too many, on the southern region too. But the main places these locomotives worked were on the London Midland region and the London North Eastern region too, in the 1950s and the 1960s, working in a lot of areas that required freight services. But they were really helping speed those services up. A lot more of the fast-fitted freights that were starting to run throughout the 1950s, and some of the early block freight traffic that was running too, was handled by these locomotives. But at the same time, you could still find them out there on some of the slower, heavier freight duties, such as this mineral train that we see here on our screen, and an iron ore train using some of the 27-ton iron ore hoppers that we see here. So you can see there, the locomotives were all fitted with smoke deflectors, apart from the Crosty boilered variation, with a variety of different tenders from the BR standard designs, dependent on the amount of coal capacity and the water capacity needed for the separate regions there. Some locomotives are trialled with a double blast pipe and double chimney, and I'll just try and find you a photo with one on. There we go. You can see here, this now has the double chimney design and one of BR's smaller tenders. And this was trialled on number 92165 originally, and this was a very successful improvement, then rolled out from all subsequent locomotives. So from 92165 right through to 92250, all the locomotives were either then built or modified with the double chimney apparatus, with the locomotives before this remaining with their single chimney until withdrawal. So the locomotives were proving really successful at this point. They were actually replacing a lot of those earlier Big Four designs and quite a few of the War Department austerity locomotives on the faster freight duties across the UK. And it was envisaged that these locomotives would last in service right through until around the early 1980s, until they could be replaced by electrification on major parts of the network. They had a shelf life of around 30 or 40 years, but that was quite cruelly cut short, really. These locomotives had a lot more life to give. In 1955, the British Transport Commission said that no more steam locomotives were to be designed or made for the UK railway network, they were now fully concentrating on electrification and the dieselisation. But the standard design was so successful, additional locomotives of this type were built right through until 1960, with many being built at Crewe. There was around 198, I believe, built at Crewe Works, and the remainder built at Swindon Works in former Great Western Territory. This, of course, gives us the final standard locomotive built for British Railways, and this is 92220. This was the final locomotive ever built by British Railways, steam locomotive that is, although the numbers do go consecutively higher, right up to 92250. These locomotives were started and completed prior to number 92220, so this is the final locomotive started and completed for the UK's railway network. Appropriately, this was turned out in full BR lined green livery, the first of the BR standard 9Fs to be painted in this colour scheme rather than a plain freight black colour scheme. It was named here appropriately Evening Star, which was subject to a competition from various different Swindon workshop workers. They held a ballot, I believe, and some people came up with Evening Star to commemorate the evening, of course, of BR steam locomotive construction, and harking back to quite a few of those traditional Great Western locomotive names, such as North Star and Morning Star, as carried by Great Western locomotives of yesteryear. This locomotive entered service in 1960, and it was withdrawn by 1965, so it had a service life of only 5 years. And as you can see, it was treated as per a standard member of the 9F class. It was still allowed to get quite dirty and grubby. You can just about make out the BR green livery under here, as you can see. And of course, the all-important Evening Star nameplate in the Western region style, and the commemorative plate underneath showcasing that this was the final locomotive built for British Railways. So the locomotives were now coming to an end, but they did go out in a bit of glory. Several of the engines did work on passenger duties too. Although they were a heavy freight design mainly, these locomotives proved very successful indeed at hauling express passenger duties, mainly in the summer months when other locomotives were tied up on other duties. They'd work interregional holiday express trains, and some were used in South Wales as standby locomotives for expresses too. Although the departmental managers didn't really turn too interested to this, did really turn the noses up at it quite a bit. They did put in some fantastic performances on these duties with speeds up to 90 miles an hour performed by these Stanier 9F locomotives. It's at this time the designs really graduated north too, with their main hotspots during their final years being the lowlands of Scotland, with locomotives based at Carlisle, and of course based in the northwest of England too. But their time was coming to an end. Despite plans, they weren't going to last until the 1980s, with the final locomotives withdrawn, steam locomotives withdrawn from UK service in 1968. The 9Fs were some of the last to go, with 18 of the designs being serviceable in 1968, and the first locomotives having only been withdrawn in 1964. So none of these locomotives had over a 16 or 17 or so year lifespan, which it is tragic, really, considering the development and the success of this particular design. But their place was commemorated in preservation, with 9 of the locomotives surviving with us today. These have been various working locomotives and display locomotives too, that you can see all across the UK in preservation. And some of these have returned to the main line too within recent years, with the final locomotive itself, Evening Star, seen here on a rail tour in the 1970s. This was a famous locomotive that performed quite often in this period, showing just what the 9Fs were capable of on these fast express passenger duties, this time, of course, just for enthusiasts, rather than British Rail's commercial services. This loco has its place in the National Railway Museum collection, and you can see it there in the National Railway Museum at York too. Various different railways have privately preserved 9F locomotives, including the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, the Bluebell Railway, and the Great Central Railway. Some of these have been painted in initially fictitious, but then, of course, everything comes part of history at some point, liveries, with this locomotive here being the first to carry the mixed traffic lined black, which was not a prototypical era from the BR times, and of course gaining a name there very similar to that carried by the London North Eastern Railway P2 class locomotives. This loco has since been painted in the same Brunswick green livery that is carried by Evening Star, and I believe at the moment is named Leicester City after the football club from where it lives nearby now, being a local locomotive to Leicester, of course, commemorating the football club that is nearby. Black Prince is also a famous locomotive saved by the wildlife conservationist David Shepherd, and I have a model of that locomotive here in Engage. This locomotive holds the UK record for the heaviest freight recorded that was hauled by a steam locomotive. This was set in 1982 and is 2,178 tons, hauling some of the more modern bogie aggregate hoppers that were based at the Foster Yeoman depot in the Mendips there. So still showing that in the 1980s, these locomotives could haul heavy freights. That was the original intention, and it's great to see that they still did get the chance, although only on one occasion. Heading over to the models, there's been a great variation of them and made available in different scales too. Hornby's had various different models of the 9F available throughout its life, starting off in the late 1960s, with models continuously developed through to the current day. These models have had various different toolings and upgrades over this period, starting here, as we can see, with a tender drive model from the 1980s, with the original style couplings there, but still a great level of detail for its time. This has since entered the railroad range, as we can see in front of us here. It's the same tooling, but it does now have a 5-pole motor in the locomotive and a digital socket in the tender too. At the time this upgrade was taken, Hornby tooled up for the first time the Crosty Class 9Fs too. This was the first ready-to-run versions of these particular locomotives that were made available. These had full NEM couplings and also had great weathering on them and a 5-pole motor in the locomotive. Although technically part of the railroad range, they still had quite a lot of detail on them, and you can pick them up from us from time to time if you check out our pre-owned listings. And as usual, I've put a link in the description for you showing you all the 9F locomotives we have either available right now or available to pre-order. Of course, within the last few days, Hornby has announced a brand new version of the 9F for 2021, a whole new tooling from the ground up with 3 variations listed so far, covering the early emblem colour scheme, the late crest colour scheme, and of course, Evening Star again in that iconic one-off livery from its construction in 1960. So those are available to pre-order now. We're expecting those towards the end of 2021. And as soon as I've got more to show you there, including toolings, engineering prototypes, livery samples, etc., we'll be putting those on our website for a bit of a closer look. The other 2 00 gauge models I've got here in front of me are from the Bachmann range. Bachmann tooled up a brand new 9F in the mid-2000s, and this again has a motor in the locomotive as well as an 8-pin digital socket in there and space in the tender for a sound speaker. They have produced many variations covering both the single and the double chimney styles of the 9F, with many different tenders and covering some of those preservation liveries too. If you're looking for one of those 9F models, do head over to our pre-owned listings where we do have several available. Finally, looking at the N-gauge, we are looking at Dapol's 9F, which made an entrance in the late 2000s. It has become quite sought after now. It's not been part of the range for quite a few years, but there were many variations made again, and Dapol have hinted at a return for this particular model, which comes with a motor in the tender and a 6-pin digital socket as standard. We do have them from time to time again on our pre-owned listings, but if we do get a new release of this fantastic model from Dapol, we will be adding it to our website if you'd like to learn some more details there too. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the 9F. It is a bit of a bittersweet story, really, in that I should be able to tell you so much more. I should be sitting here now telling you how they were a very successful steam locomotive, hauling freight into the 1970s, telling you their exploits and withdrawal in the 1980s. Unfortunately, the life was cut short. I can't tell you the story that these locomotives were meant to have, but they were still a fantastically successful design, and the amount of different duties and their lifespans really does pay testament to the success of this particular locomotive, working on both freight and passenger duties throughout their BR lives and making a real statement for themselves following withdrawal from British Railways too. It's perfectly sensible that these are well regarded in preservation by locomotive crews and enthusiasts alike, and it's fantastic that we've got so many highly detailed models of the various different types available in many scales too. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little more about the 9F. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and Facebook page for more real railway profile videos, and of course our model skills cast sessions and the model railway news too. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, don't hesitate to put a comment under the video or get in touch with our customer experience team, who'd be happy to help you out also. All the models I've shown here today are either available right now or are available on our pre-owned section on our website. So head over there, via that link in the description if you'd like to find out some more. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.